Hey, I'm Mo for YouTube videos. I am a feminist and a lesbian, and I make conversational commentary videos about both of those things. Don't I, Jojo? Yeah? I've been having kind of a weird few days with my head, and I wanted to film anyway because there is less than 30 days left until the election here in the United States, and I realized at the beginning of this month that I had much less time than I had kind of assumed to get my election content out. I'm hoping the energy is close enough to how it normally is, that this feels like a weird thing that I even warned you about, but, just, I'm not currently in pain, but I'm showing up while I'm feeling weird, and if that's coming across in the video, that's why. Also, if it gets less well lit later in the video, that's also why. It's supposed to rain tomorrow. I've referenced the claim that I want to talk about in today's video a few times in prior videos of mine in very flippant ways. The claim that I've been making that Jill Stein is a grifter. And even though I have phrased that in a very incendiary way, even people who clearly haven't thought that or heard that talking point before have come to me really in good faith, considering, again, just like I've phrased it in a very fighting words sort of way. So I wanted to make a video to explain why I use such fighting words. I don't particularly think I'm talking to a ton of first-time voters right now, and I'm also not self-important enough to think that I would be the final answer that any first-time voter would be looking for. But my analytics do tell me that 23% of you are in the 18 to 24 bracket here in the Nuance Corner. I am 26. I was 18 at the time of the 2016 election. A few months into being 18, something I am still very grateful for because I think I would have gone bananas watching that election play out and then not being able to vote in it by a few months. Shout out to people who had to live through that because that sounds like it would have sucked. It was my first time voting ever, though. I hadn't aged into voting in a midterm season. I aged into voting the July before that November. I voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, and I was very deeply, in retrospect, foolishly confident. I remember adults in my life. I lived in Seattle at the time, so they were like nice, well-meaning liberal adults being like, oh my god, I'm so sorry, when they would realize that it was my first election. And like I said, deeply confident, I would be like, oh no, don't be sorry. I get to vote for a woman, and obviously she's gonna win because look who she's running against. And, well, I did get to vote for a woman, and she didn't win, even though, oh my god, look who she was running against. But the thing that I used to say was, it could be worse. And, oh man, I mean, in retrospect, looking back at it, I struggle to see a way that it could be worse, unless the next election, or maybe this one, was my first election. This is now my third presidential election. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I voted for Joe Biden in 2020. I, of course, voted in primaries and midterms in between. My primary pick, back when we had that big, beautiful primary field, was Elizabeth Warren. Because I am in Massachusetts. But I still cast my vote for Joe Biden, and I felt much less confident than I had in 2016. Based on how math works, a lot of the rest of my audience was there with me for that between 2016 and 2020, and now I'm obviously not speaking only to my 18 to 24 bracket. But a lot of the rest of this is going to sound extremely familiar to those of us who have been there, and, hopefully that's at least validating or something. Not only was 2016 the first election that I was old enough to vote in, it was also the first one I was, truly allowed to witness. I have mentioned in videos before that I grew up homeschooled and very deeply sheltered. One morning in September, my mother watched the news, and she convinced herself that what she saw on the news was a result of her specifically watching the news, and the news was then banned in my house just like for the rest of the time that I lived in that house until I left. Rules changed very often just based on whims, but that one stuck around a lot. The only election coverage that I remember very specifically was Fox News muted, and I do remember that I watched part of one of the Obama-Romney debates and had like no idea what was going on up until 2015, where I was allowed to, even in the privacy of my room, watch the news without worrying about getting in trouble or being told I was doing something I was not supposed to do. I was uninformed, and then I became as informed as I could be at that time. All this to say, I am not somebody who was raised with politics being instilled into me or voting as like a hardcore belief, something that was passed down to me. I don't know for sure how many presidential elections my mother even voted in. The only time I remember her voting was if she had a chance to vote against gay marriage or abortion. So if all of that had happened for me, but 4 or 8 years later, and I was aware of somebody who was willing to walk me through why they personally think that Jill Stein is a grifter and why they don't think that a third-party vote is particularly worthwhile right now, I might be interested in hearing them out. So this is for you, if you're interested in hearing that out. Just right off the bat, like, I don't think you're stupid. I know a lot of people who try to speak to potential third-party voters pretend that you're stupid. They pretend that you are imagining a different outcome than you probably are. I am going to be quoting from articles from 2016, which were written at a time when it was kind of a belief of at least some people that Jill Stein might somehow pull off a win, but I don't believe that most anybody who is seriously considering voting for Jill Stein this time around thinks that she's actually going to win, right? Obviously, my personal endorsement, the thing that I have been advocating about in my videos so far when I have spoken about voting, I do think that a vote for Kamala Harris is the best one. I will be making that case in this video, but also, even if you're still going to vote third party, I think that there are better options than Jill Stein. Like, Jill Stein in specific, just, I don't trust her. We're going to get into a lot of reasons that I don't trust her. That is definitely something that I noticed as I was looking for resources for this video. As if I wasn't already thinking about 2016 enough, I realized that most of the sources that I could find about Jill were from last time around for her. She did not run in 2020. They ran another candidate who tried explicitly to peel off Democratic Party voters and did like hashtag Dem exit, and he got even less votes than Jill, so she tagged back in. Or maybe she sat out 2020 because she, like me, when I cast that less confident vote for Joe Biden, assumed that Trump was gonna retain hold of the White House? I don't know. It's a theory. It's a Jill Stein theory. I'm not entirely sure the specifics of Jill Stein's grift. I am just sure that I believe that it exists. But I want to acknowledge, again, so that I'm not arguing with a straw man here, because I think that's an important thing to try to do if you want to talk about politics, especially if you're trying to talk about them in a somewhat nuanced way. Because my thing is, I am nuanced for other people who are on the left. I don't have a lot of nuance for the right. I know that it's kind of a controversial opinion that centrists can be reasoned with, but, like, I do think they can. And I'm a big, like, for right now, what's super important is coalition. Kind of Democrat. So, like, I don't think you're stupid if you have considered a Jill Stein vote or if you voted for Jill Stein in the past. If you just haven't looked deeply into some of this, my anger at a grifter shouldn't be misconstrued at anger towards the people that she has grifted, right? But second of all, like I said, I know a lot of people are not considering a Jill Stein vote because they think that she can win. It's mostly because, and this is something that Jill is intentionally playing into, because people feel like they can't vote for Kamala Harris. Or because they feel like they can't vote for Kamala Harris, and also because they're being told that it will increase funding and visibility for the Green Party if they vote for Jill, even though there's no way that it will result in her election. I think this is a good thought, but a misguided one. My research tells me that these public funds have a cap. You reach 5%, I think. I think it's 5%. I'm going to put it on the screen if it's different. You reach a certain percent, something that it is very, very unlikely Jill Stein will ever do, and you would get a limited amount of public funds. These public funds have a cap of $20 million, and they forbid you from accepting any private donations. You can only spend that money, and you can only spend that amount of money. And it does seem to be more money than I can find listed on the Open Secrets campaign funding website for Jill Stein's 2016 run. But I'm just saying right now, just memorializing for when somebody eventually digs up more about this and we find out that she's been accepting money from various sources once she's done pretending like she's a serious candidate and she's been exposed as a grifter. When we find out that she was getting a lot more campaign money that she did not declare, I will not be surprised. And if we find out that it is a Russia thing, even just like the Tim Pool thing where she's going to pretend like she didn't realize, I will very much not be surprised. I will be somehow even less surprised. I just don't think that the Green Party would run a Jill Stein campaign and refuse to accept any private donations. Like, maybe for a different candidate, but not with Jill at the top of the ticket. I find it very difficult to imagine Jill accepting this deal if she got it, but you might not be as convinced about that as I am, and that's totally fine. But just for reference, for what it's worth, John McCain was the last person to accept and try to run on only that public financing in 2008. And $20 million was like a lot more money in 2008, I think. So again, I'm not going to spend too much time being like Jill Stein cannot win, because I truly feel like most people understand that. But my point is kind of more that not only can Jill Stein not win, but she should not win even if she could. That she shouldn't be being rewarded for morals that she doesn't seem to possess with no plan or experience or ability to govern. And that's something that I would really like to explore here. But back in 2016, Jill Stein cannot win was something that on its own needed more selling to the audience, largely because of the discontent with that year's nominee, Hillary Clinton. There was a huge amount of support for her primary opponent, Bernie Sanders, in 2016, and I do think that a lot more people were convinced that she had a chance at victory when they imagined what would happen if all Bernie Sanders supporters and also the Green Party and other independents all voted for Jill rather than for Trump or for Hillary. But that's not what happened. While a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters felt abandoned enough by the Democratic Party to vote outside of it in 2016, a lot of them did still hold their nose and vote for Hillary Clinton. I'm not and was not a Bernie bro or a Bernie bro defender. Some of them did stay home or vote for Trump or only voted down ballot, but many, many Sanders Democrats did still vote for Hillary Clinton, something that I think is under-acknowledged in conversations among Democrats, because they understood what was at stake and they understood that Jill's campaign was offering nothing but a false hope. Didn't they, Jojo? Really? The 2016 platform for Jill was a lot about forgiving student debt, something a lot of legal experts had been saying even at the time is not quite possible in the way that Jill was presenting it. I'm just going to be honest, I didn't get to go to college yet. I have not been keeping up on student loan relief. That was not a single issue for me to vote on in 2016. I would argue that student loan relief is rarely the single vote issue, right? And I also think we can say without really getting into it that the repeated blocking of Joe Biden's attempts at student loan forgiveness proved those speculators who were saying she couldn't actually do it the way she said she would, right. But the reason that I remember that she really wanted to forgive student loan debt is because the talking point was that if everybody who had that kind of debt simply came out and voted for her, that she would easily win. I'm in favor of student loan debt forgiveness. I'm in favor of medical debt forgiveness. I am extremely in favor of all kinds of debt forgiveness. But But to assume that everybody who has that kind of debt would also vote that everybody who has that kind of debt should have it forgiven is really naive, I think. A lot of people conceive of their student loan debt as like the bootstraps by which they are pulling themselves up or whatever, and would not vote to take that away from other people. People don't always vote in what is like nakedly and baldly in their best interest. Another one of my electoral pilled videos coming soon. I'm going to talk about a very visible lobby behind a minimum wage increase question in my state. I read a few articles for this video, like I said, and you can find them linked in the description below. But the one I want to start with is an article from 2016 called The Case Against Jill Stein by Tessa Stewart for Rolling Stone. And it'll back up what I was saying about how different that campaign is from this one that's currently being run. By now, supporters of Green Party nominee Jill Stein are used to hearing she can't win. For those who watched Bernie Sanders come close to snatching the Democratic nomination from DNC favorite Hillary Clinton, that's frustrating. For one thing, the platform Stein is running on has a lot in common with Sanders. Stein supports single-payer health care and opposes fracking, for instance, two pieces of Sanders' agenda that didn't make it onto the Democratic Party platform this year, and Stein, unlike Sanders, has the full support of her party. Is it so crazy to think that she might be able to marshal the support of Sanders voters and other independents turned off by the historically unpopular major party candidates and let the revolution carry her to the White House? Yes, it is. With only 67 days until the election, the Green Party is on the ballot in just 39 states and the District of Columbia. So the article then carried on and laid out the electoral improbability of a Jill Stein win, and I did want to see if she was faring better this time than last. Like, you know, is she more accessible on the ballot this time around? And she's not available on the ballot in all 50 states this time. Her team seems to have been given the wrong form in Nevada, where she was submitted as a question rather than as a candidate. And the Supreme Court ruled that it was, in fact, up to the Green Party to carefully read the forms that they were filling out and submitting for Jill's presidential run. So that did not get overturned. I'm not even going to argue that the Democrats never ever play dirty to shut down a Green Party candidate, but I do think that this one is a big fat L for the Green Party and for Jill Stein's campaign. And I really super don't blame the court for not fixing it, because how are you not more careful after you weren't able to be on the ballot in all 50 states last time around? How is that not day one in your campaign HQ? Hey, let's make sure every single ballot application is completely beyond reproach this time. Unless maybe you're not very serious about winning. And it's not just Nevada, there's also Ohio. She's on the ballot in Ohio, but votes for her won't count because she didn't pick a running mate until the deadline had passed to officially replace that running mate. And like, again, I really struggle to feel like this is Green Party specific sabotage, because the whole entire reason that the Democrats rushed to confirm Kamala as early as they did, weeks before the DNC, my real electoral heads will know, because they were predicting lawsuits about a change if they made it too late after Joe Biden was on the ballot. The Republicans have been super pissed that they missed their opportunity to have those kinds of lawsuits because of the rushing with the DNC. And if I, some random lady, just some random 26-year-old lesbian who is into electoral politics, if I understood that that was going on, how was that not something they were very aware of and very much in communication about at HQ for Jill Stein? You would just think with all of that chatter around it in Kamala's case that they would be very obviously thinking about wanting to make sure that they don't miss deadlines for their own VP swap last time around. And, well, this time too, because Jill didn't win anything between 2016 and now. Another reason for an improbability of a Jill Stein win was that she hadn't won any elections that ever mattered in her entire career. This article from Tessa Stewart outlines many of those losses and says, to be sure, some amount of the blame for those losses must be attributed to the structural barriers that prevent third parties from gaining traction in the United States. The fact that most cities and states operate on a winner-take-all rather than ranked choice or instant runoff system, for instance, and that it takes millions of dollars and countless hours to successfully petition to get on the ballot in many states. But the fact remains that in her entire political career, Stein has only gotten elected to one position, representative to the town meeting of Lexington, Massachusetts. Still, Stein insists she can pull out a win in this, the highest stakes race of her career. All she needs is for all 43 million people who carry student debt to come out to the polls and vote for her, she says. Not all Green Party supporters are fully buying this. Noam Chomsky, who's backing Stein, explained the inner conflict he and others feel in an interview with Democracy Now! In a swing state, a state where it's going to matter which way you vote, I would vote against Donald Trump. And by elementary arithmetic, that means you hold your nose and you vote Democrat, he said. I don't think there's any other rational choice. Abstaining from voting, or say voting for a candidate you prefer, a minority candidate, just amounts to a vote for Donald Trump, which I think is a devastating prospect. Noam Chomsky has said this multiple times, actually. I found a clip.
Well, it's exactly what I've said in every previous election. If you happen to be, say, in Massachusetts, where we are now, which is a safe state.
For the Democrats.
So you can vote any way you want or not vote. If you happen to be in a swing state where it's going to have an effect on who becomes president, you should definitely vote. I mean, if you
So you're in Ohio this November, you vote Clinton rather than Donald Trump or Ted Cruz?
Oh, absolutely. Just as I would in 2000. I didn't like Obama, but I said exactly the same thing. There's a
So Hillary has your vote if you were in a swing state?
Well, let's put it that way.
Yes.
My vote would be against the Republican candidate.
And honestly, while we're here, so has Angela Davis. She was saying that about Joe Biden.
When I interviewed you in 2016, you said you wouldn't support either main party candidate at the time. What are your thoughts today for 2020?
Well, my position really hasn't changed. I'm not going to actually support either of the major candidates, but I do think we have to participate in the election. I mean, that isn't to say that I won't vote for the Democratic candidate. What I'm saying is that in our electoral system as it exists, neither party represents the future that we need in this country. Both parties remain connected to corporate capitalism. But the election will not so much be about who gets to lead the country to a better future, but rather how we can support ourselves and our own ability to continue to organize and place pressure on those in power. And I don't think there's a question about which candidate would allow that process to unfold. So I think that we're going to have to translate some of the passion that has characterized these demonstrations into work within the electoral arena, recognizing that the electoral arena is not the best place for the expression of radical politics. But if we want to continue this work, we certainly need a person in office who will be more amenable to our mass pressure. And to me, that is the only thing that someone like Joe Biden represents. But we have to persuade people to go out and vote to guarantee that the current occupant of the White House is forever ousted.
And again now about Kamala in 2024. And my take on pretty much everything to do with politics is I am neither smarter nor more radical than Angela Davis. I agree with Angela Davis that you need to vote for the material reality that will be easiest to organize under. And I fundamentally disagree with all of the internet accelerationist takes that think that because protests seemed to them to be more visible and organized under a Trump administration, that we would suddenly turn into some beautiful organizing utopia, and that will not happen. To be clear, it also will not happen under a Kamala Harris presidency. It would not happen under a Jill Stein presidency either, if that were remotely possible. It just is not going to happen. Like, I would prefer to have a president who has previously supported and circulated links to bail funds for protesters compared to the one who was president at the time and tweeted, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." Again, Jill Stein not really being a serious option, I have to vote against one of those, and it's a pretty easy choice. I mean, Donald Trump says that he would disenfranchise anybody who burned an American flag. A Donald Trump administration could, you know, even if everybody is sounding the alarm a little bit too early about this potentially being the last election, even though I genuinely do not think that it's a stretch to say that Trump might not hand over power, he already, like, we've seen this already. He explicitly got a vice president this time who would do it. But, like, do you want him making a registry of people who he wants to take the right to vote away from, or do you want to just keep him the fuck out of the White House until he dies? Because we could do that. He's very old. I don't think there are very many more elections where we're going to have to vote against Donald Trump specifically. But again, back to Angela Davis and Noam Chomsky and simple electoral math. Jill, of course, has an answer to this very rational reason for swing state voters to participate in the shitty team relay race of democracy every 4 years. The answer is kind of implying that she is actually smarter than Noam Chomsky. Rolling Stone again. Stein dismissed Chomsky's rationale, saying he subscribes to the politics of fear. The politics of fear, Stein is fond of saying, says you have to vote against the candidate you fear rather than for the candidate who shares your values. I have some thoughts about Jill Stein and these politics of fear. I think Jill Stein herself, like all politicians, benefits from the politics of fear. But I think Jill does it in a way that is, short of the whole Donald Trump selling parts of his debate suit and NFTs and watches and stuff, probably one of the most, like, profitable seeming ones that I have witnessed. So, spoiler alert, we're gonna talk more about her 2016 campaign in a bit, but she lost. She lost the election in 2016. Jill Stein did not win. Hillary Clinton also did not win. It's argued in many places by many people that Hillary Clinton did not win because of Jill Stein, and, like, yeah, I do kind of buy that. Yes, the numbers that are cited for that argument are normally cited because a lot of states that went to Biden relatively easily in 2020 had a margin of victory over Trump that would have been, like, eaten up if everybody who voted for Jill Stein the first time around voted for her again the second time around, probably. Jill was pulling numbers away from Hillary in 2016, and she stands to pull numbers away from Kamala in 2024. Obviously, some voters would vote for Jill and not for a Democratic candidate, but the Green Party consistently pulls from Democratic votes, which is why we see Jill Stein blamed and not Gary Johnson, the Libertarian candidate from 2016. And I'm pulling from this article a bit more for the numbers than for the sentiment, but it says here, in 2016, Trump's margin of victory in Pennsylvania was 44,292 voters. Stein's vote was 49,941. In Michigan, Trump's margin was 10,704, and Stein's vote was 51,463. In Wisconsin, Trump's margin was 22,748, and Stein's vote was 31,072. Let's look at some of the numbers. In 2016, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, otherwise known as the Blue Wall, Stein's campaign specifically targeted disaffected Democratic voters, especially those who had supported Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. When all the focus was on Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the question was who he would siphon more votes from. However, it is very clear that Stein siphons votes from Harris in a much bigger way than Trump, given that she is to the left of Harris on a number of issues. If her small but significant vote remains close to how she performed in 2016, she could very well be responsible for the disaster of another Trump presidency. It is particularly noteworthy that in those 3 states, Biden's share of the vote in 2020 rose relative to Clinton's in 2016, while Trump's vote share remained about the same. It would be fair to conclude that with far fewer third-party votes in 2020, Biden was able to take a disproportionate share of the 2016 third-party vote to narrowly win those 3 battleground states over Trump. So if I were speaking to a slightly younger friend of mine and they wanted to know why people say that Jill Stein is the reason that Hillary Clinton lost the election, I would explain that to them. And I would also tell them, you know, like, I don't think that that's the most productive way to speak about voting anyway. I would tell them I understand why some people voted for Jill Stein. And I would tell them that I think that a third-party candidate can be an excellent option in local and small elections. And then I would say, you know, I saw this tweet once, because this was genuinely a helpful thing for me to find phrasing for. The saying is something along the lines of, like, when you're voting, you're not going to get to vote for the one, this, like, perfect candidate who is going to align with you on everything, but you do have to kind of approach it like public transit. You're going to take the bus that's going to get you closest to where you want to go, and then you got to hoof it from there. I don't like all of Kamala Harris's current positioning. I also don't know to what extent she's movable once she's elected and doesn't have to run as Joe Biden's vice president. I give a lot of grace right now to the fact that she is the sitting vice president, and I understand that to a lot of people that does the opposite. It makes them say, I'm so sorry, my cat is running around so much right now. Yeah, I heard you. And I do understand reading that as Kamala being explicitly very involved in all of this, but also I think we don't really know what's going to go on with her after November, the way that we could predict that Joe Biden probably would have continued on exactly the same path, and the way that we can predict what Donald Trump would do. And I do want to push back on how I see people saying, well, it can't get worse. It can get worse. It can get worse to the tune of Donald Trump wanting to give his son oceanfront properties. It can get worse to the tune of the guy who just gave Bibi a total domination hat getting in office. It's comfortable for us to say, well, it can't get worse, because I fear that the worst that it is for us, and this is a reason why I don't speak a lot about this issue, because I fear that a lot of the concern about it becomes self-centered. And maybe if that's the only way to make change, it's the only way to make change, but I feel that it's more about American guilt than it is for actually wanting what's happening to stop. I'm not convinced, even though I do believe that we should do an arms embargo, that an arms embargo would solve much more other than placating American conscience for a few months until Donald Trump wins the election, because an arms embargo would lose the election for the Democrats. And it fucking sucks that that's where we are. I hate that that's where we are. I don't want that to be where we are, but it's where we are. I think Kamala Harris has proven herself to be a relatively movable politician, and I also think we have increasingly seen the Democratic Party move closer and closer to being not in favor of continuing to just fund this forever. So while I don't get to vote for somebody who's taking exactly the approach that I would like, I do get to vote for somebody who I think probably is going to be steered by her party in that direction once Joe Biden is out of office. And it may be a naive hope, but I do think that it's a less naive hope than the hope that Jill Stein could somehow get into office and actually be at all effective in implementing her agenda. But I'm not really here to say that people who voted for Jill in 2016 were directly responsible for Trump, in part because I don't think it's a very compelling argument, right? They voted for Jill because they were courted by her promises and also by this line she gives about not wanting to be ruled by the politics of fear. And then Jill turned around and she profited off of fear. She profited off of fear that arguably didn't need to exist in such great scale had she not shaved off those votes for Hillary in the blue wall. So after Jill Stein and Hillary Clinton both lost the 2016 election, Jill Stein raised $6.5 million or so for a recount, and like a lot of things with Jill's finances, it's hard for me in my research to pin down exactly what she then did with that money. What she said she was going to do with that money was file lawsuits to force recounts, a few of which did eventually pop up. And then that she was going to let donors vote on how to spend the extra money. The millions of dollars of extra money. And then she did not. She paid her staff, and apparently paid her staff more than she had been paying them during her failed presidential run, now that she had all of this cash. And this was my first tipping point for Jill Stein, where I went from like, oh, she's just some lady who can never win and is giving people somebody else to vote for, to, oh, wait, this is a scam artist. Something I always wonder when I think about this recount effort is how many of the people who donated to her cause were first-time voters. I knew first-time voters who voted for Hillary and then also donated to Jill's recount effort, hoping that Jill could do something, could reverse the results of the election. It was false hope in response to fear, false hope she charged money for people to feel. And yeah, okay, sure, we could say everyone does that. I'm sure that a lot of the complaints that I am levying against Jill will just be crumpled up at me and thrown back at me and said, but the Democrats... And sure, but like Hillary did not accept millions of dollars of donations based on something that was very clearly not going to undo the results of the election and pretend like it might possibly undo the results of the election. And that big payday is always going to be the first thing that pops into my head when I hear about Jill Stein's whole politics of fear thing. For that to be the line from somebody who faces the most success, the more fearful people feel, just feels too rich for me not to comment on. But casting that to the side, pretending like it doesn't bother me as much as it does, there are also just issues with these morals that she's constantly being praised for because they're very, very inconsistent. That article from 2016 does a great job at laying some of this out, including Jill's brief and very quickly edited support of Brexit. No, seriously. Tessa writes, for example, when the UK, buffeted by anti-immigrant sentiment, shocked the world by voting to leave the European Union this summer, Stein released a statement hailing the referendum results. She called the Brexit vote, quote, a victory for those who believe in the right of self-determination and who reject the pro-corporate austerity policies of the political elites in the EU, and a rejection of the European political elite and their contempt for ordinary people. People want change, and they will get it one way or the other, Stein wrote. The challenge is now to expand the political movement in the United States. When her progressive supporters, including members of the UK Green Party, the official position of which was to support remaining in the EU, balked at Stein's interpretation of the results, she quickly overhauled the statement, stripping out words like victory and adding a line that claimed, before the Brexit vote, I agreed with Jeremy Corbyn, Caroline Lucas, and the UK Greens who supported staying in the EU. Stein didn't acknowledge these changes, though, responding to indignant supporters on Facebook by saying only, you may not be seeing the actual text of this statement. Try clearing your cache. The original and revised versions can be viewed thanks to the Internet Archive. And in terms of social media statements that she needed to walk back, there's also this one. On Twitter, Stein was forced to walk back gendered criticisms of her Democratic rival. She tweeted in May, I agree with Hillary. It's time to elect a woman for president, but I want that president to reflect the values of being a mother. Hashtag Mother's Day. When incensed Twitter users criticized the apparent attack on Clinton's parenting, Stein cowed, I'm sorry if I wasn't very clear on Mother's Day. I wasn't criticizing Hillary as a mother. I was criticizing her record as a warmonger, she said. Stein's warmonger criticism stems largely from Clinton's support of airstrikes in Syria during her tenure as Secretary of State. Interestingly, Stein has not applied that same level to Russian President Vladimir Putin, who called for and oversaw airstrikes on the same country. In fact, Stein touted in a press release that she sat at the same table as Putin during a dinner for RT, the Russian government-funded television network, in Moscow last December, 2 months after Russia started bombing Syria. In that press release, Stein criticizes U.S. foreign policy in Syria and elsewhere and acknowledges that in Russia, quote, money runs short for critical needs because of the heavy burden of military spending, end quote, but stops short of remarking on Russia's Syrian bombing campaign, abysmal human rights records, or abhorrent treatment of the LGBT community. This despite the Green Party's staunch commitment to advocating for human rights around the world. I want to be clear that while I think that it is admirable that Jill Stein at least fronts as if she has empathy for Palestine, painting her broadly as an anti-genocide candidate does not seem earned. It seems like it is this cycle's version of student loan forgiveness, a big promise that she can make and not have to worry about actually successfully having to pull off, and a thing that is or should be extremely popular with voters. But Jill holds none of that same concern for Syria, none of that same concern for Ukraine. The opposition to the genocide in Gaza isn't coming from a long, rich history of Jill Stein deeply caring about anything other than what she thinks will make her the most admirable to the college-educated Democrat crowd. And even then, she still does not do a great job at calculating. Like we saw the Brexit misfire, but this next aspect of Jill's whole platform and bullshit probably does make me really kind of the angriest. And it's something that I know a lot of people who otherwise support her just maybe do not know about, because this part is pretty completely and utterly disqualifying. I know she had a sassy little comeback about Hillary being a warmonger, but this to me is really disqualifying for a presidential candidate. Jill Stein thinks that vaccines cause autism, or at least she wants people who think that to feel very, very comfortable about voting for her. She courted the vaccine skeptical and anti-vaccine vote much more the last time around than she seems to have this time. I think because it was so documented the first time around that that's what she was doing. In fact, let's go over it. Because it's not just that Rolling Stone article, which is where we will start. For those who find it easy to dismiss Stein's social media missteps and her hypocrisy on tax returns and foreign policy, there is a question that looms larger. What about her feigned ignorance on issues that fall squarely within her one real area of expertise, medicine? Stein, who holds both undergraduate and medical degrees from Harvard, has coyly and repeatedly courted conspiracy theorists who link autism to vaccines. When pressed on the issue of whether Wi-Fi is dangerous, Stein once said, "We should not be subjecting kids' brains especially to that. It's very hard to study that stuff. We make guinea pigs out of whole populations, and then we discover how many die." And despite abundant evidence that genetically modified foods pose no threats to human health, Stein has called for a moratorium on GMOs that would include some 92% of US-grown corn and 94% of soybeans, according to the USDA. Not only are these anti-science views pernicious, they also undermine the Green Party's legitimately important climate change agenda. I found other people talking about it, too. Here's one from Slate. She just can't help herself. Jill Stein, the Harvard-educated doctor and Green Party candidate for president, was given yet another opportunity to clarify her position on whether vaccines are safe for children during an interview with the Washington Post published Friday, and yet again, she delivered an answer that not so subtly pandered to immunization skeptics. As a medical doctor, there was a time where I looked very closely at those concerns, and not all those concerns were completely resolved, Stein said. There were concerns among physicians about what the vaccine schedule meant, the toxic substances like mercury, which used to be rampant in vaccines. There were real questions that needed to be addressed. I think some of them at least have been addressed. I don't know if all of them have been addressed. Let's consider this statement carefully. Stein is invoking her authority as a medical professional to say that there were legitimate reasons to be concerned about the toxicity of vaccines, and that she doesn't know if those issues have been resolved. Stein is not saying vaccines are necessarily unsafe, but for all she knows, they might be. Some way, somehow. She is leaving open the possibility. Back here on Earth, there is no evidence that vaccines pose a danger to children's health. Doctors know this. Stein's new answer on vaccines may actually be more egregious than the Reddit AMA post in which she first addressed the issue, which I reported on earlier this week. In that statement, she explained that while childhood immunization had, quote, made a huge contribution to public health, end quote, one couldn't blame parents for being skeptical of vaccines because our food and drug regulators were controlled by corporate lobbyists. She also revisited some of those themes in her Washington Post interview. Note, I transcribed this from the Post's video. The article misses a few words. I think there's no question that vaccines have transformed public health and been absolutely critical in ridding us of the scourge of many diseases, smallpox, polio, etc. So vaccines are an invaluable medication. Like any medication, they also should be, what shall we say, approved by a regulatory board that people can trust. And I think right now that is the problem, that people do not trust a Food and Drug Administration, or even the CDC for that matter, where corporate influence and the pharmaceutical industry has a lot of influence. Stein sums it all up this way. We have a real compelling need for vaccinations, Stein said. It requires an agency that we can trust to sort through all of these concerns. Stein is talking from both sides of her mouth, much as she did in the Reddit AMA. In one breath, she acknowledges that vaccines have been indispensable for public health. In another, she darkly hints that vaccines are regulated by shills for Big Pharma, an idea for which, as the Washington Post notes, there's little evidence. Of the 17 members of the Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee, the body that provides independent advice to the Food and Drug Administration on these issues, 2 work for drug companies. The others mostly work at research centers, hospitals, and medical schools. The chairwoman is Catherine Edwards, who runs the vaccine research program at the University of Vanderbilt Medical School. Perhaps some of these individuals have conflicts of interest thanks to less obvious drug industry ties. Maybe they did time in a Pfizer lab, but advocates ought to provide some evidence of that before casting aspersions. So let us review. Jill Stein says that 1, vaccines have been critical to eliminating diseases like polio. 2, there were serious questions about the safety of vaccines that may or may not have been dealt with. 3, the FDA is in the pocket of Big Pharma. Does this make Jill Stein a hardcore anti-vaxxer? No, she's not standing around telling crowds that smallpox disappeared because of better hygiene, thank God. She's not Jenny McCarthy, circa 2008. But rather than helping put to bed the concerns of worried parents, she's indulging and even encouraging their fears by saying something may be wrong with childhood immunizations, and that the government appointees who tell them otherwise are bought and paid for. Just as I wrote earlier this week, she's pandering to the anti-vaxxers without explicitly embracing their most extreme views. Update July 29th, 2016 at 6:47 p.m. Late on Friday, Stein tweeted out the following. As a medical doctor, of course I support vaccinations. I have a problem with the FDA being controlled by drug companies. This may sound reassuring. It's not. Many anti-vaxxers will claim that they support vaccines in the abstract, but believe there may be problems with the immunization schedule, a topic she brought up in her interview with the Washington Post, or that there are very specific safety issues that the medical community needs to address. Jenny McCarthy, arguably the most famous vaccine skeptic in the country, is fond of saying, "We're not an anti-vaccine movement, we're pro-safe vaccine schedule." In my opinion, it will be clear that Stein has stopped pandering to anti-vaxxers only when she unequivocally acknowledges the following. 1. Vaccines are safe and all children should be vaccinated. 2. Choosing not to vaccinate a child puts their health in danger. 3. Choosing not to vaccinate a child puts other children in danger. As a medical doctor, of course, this should not be difficult for her. And her defense to this, not something I am paraphrasing, but something that made the headline of an interview that she did with Politico, is that to call her anti-vaccine, to restate her own positions and the things that she has said about distrusting vaccine oversight, is the same against her as birtherism is against Obama. Birtherism was, the racist lie that Barack Obama had been secretly born in Kenya and that some secret hidden birth certificate would be produced and disqualify him from the presidency. A racist lie that was peddled by Donald Trump before he had even officially gone down the escalator and gone into politics, since Trump has been a big ol' racist a lot longer than he's been a Republican. Jill thinks that to repeat the things that she said and to say that it sounds like she said them in an effort to court anti-vaxxers and that she herself may distrust vaccines is the same thing as that. And she said so in an interview to Politico. Jill Stein is sick of being called an anti-vaxxer. Throughout the Green Party candidate's presidential campaign, she has been hounded by accusations that she's part of the anti-vaxxer movement, people who oppose vaccinating children based on the medically bankrupt theory that they cause autism and other diseases. But Stein says she's not a part of the movement, and that those accusing her of it are akin to those birthers who smeared President Barack Obama by claiming he was born in Kenya. My belief is that this is the birther issue to try to smear us, Stein said in an interview with Politico. But if calling her an anti-vaxxer is a charge as bankrupt as birtherism, why won't it go away? Stein won't say. That's a very good question. I think that's a very important question, Stein said, leaving it there even after being pressed. Stein's campaign was only slightly more forthcoming. It's hard to tell exactly where the rumor originated, of course, that's your job as an investigative reporter, but there is evidence that people were certainly working to propagate the rumor, said Stein press director Melissa Figueroa, who pointed to a leaked email from Robert Naiman, the director of the liberal group Just Foreign Policy that began to get attention in mid-August, in which Naiman encourages his contacts to pass on links in which Stein's stance on vaccines is criticized. And it's true. The email is intended to cast doubts that Stein accepts the scientific consensus on vaccines. It does so, however, by highlighting Stein's own words. Because while Stein never overtly claims that vaccines are responsible for autism or other diseases, some of the things she says about them are similar to statements made by the conspiracy theory's proponents, especially accusations of medical science being compromised by corporate control. To a Stein supporter, that sounds like a reasoned criticism of the power of wealthy medical corporations, but to those horrified by the resurgence of long-dormant diseases thanks to new pockets of parents who won't vaccinate their children, it's too close for comfort. It's also misleading, as the body that works on vaccine safety, the Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee, draws mostly from academia and health, not drug firms. This woman is either fundamentally unserious or maybe the stupidest person on the planet, and I can't tell which one I think is really worse in this case. There are not, in fact, serious concerns and questions about vaccines. You should give your children vaccines. Doctors think you should give your children vaccines. You should vaccinate your children. I have a few more things that I would like to say, specifically to people who are struggling with the need to vote for a Democrat in this election, because a few things that I'm seeing people say to promote apathy are really, truly bothering me. First of all, there's this idea of like, oh, every time they say that you need to vote to save democracy, LOL, the Democrats do better when they lose, so they want to lose. And I mean, like, we've well established that I am electoral brained, so whatever. But the thing that was being said in 2016 was like, if Trump gets elected, he'll be able to nominate a Republican majority to the Supreme Court. And then that was true. And then the thing that was being said in 2020 was like, hey, there's reason to believe that Trump will not peacefully transfer power. And also, we can't handle another 4 years of this. And that was also true. I'm not arguing that Joe Biden has been a perfect president. I'm not even arguing that Kamala Harris is some perfect candidate with nothing in her record for me to disagree with. What I'm arguing is that these things that we're being told about how important voting is are just unfortunately true. And unfortunately, we genuinely already know from 2016 that voting in a way that is more attached to larger conscience than to holy fuck, it cannot be Donald Trump can very much lead to it holy fuck being Donald Trump. And the main person driving votes who could do that probably already knows that that's what she's doing. Donald Trump knows that that's what she's doing. But hey, it's an easy 6 or so million if she sticks it out and then sues to recount again, right? That on top of whatever money she may be getting from Russia to tag in and play spoiler every 4 years or so. I'd say maybe Trump is paying her. She's been open to the idea of pardoning him, flirting with the idea of pardoning J6 insurrectionists on her little MAGA podcast tour. She also hired a consulting firm that one of the J6 rioters runs, apparently. and paid them $100,000, but I don't think Trump has that kind of cash on hand right now to directly be paying her. I think somebody who wants it to be Trump is paying her. And I think she kind of wants it to be Trump too. She's liking comments on Instagram suggesting voting for Trump as the alternate to voting for her. I want to make a separate video and talk about the way that Alexa Nicholas attempted to insert herself into the back and forth between AOC and Jill Stein. Vote if you can. And vote early and vote for ranked choice voting if it ever comes up in your local elections, because if that swept the nation, we wouldn't have to have this kind of conversation every 4 years. We could just vote for who we like best to least. But even then, it would take a whole nother person at the top of the ticket for me to rank the Green Party for my #1. Thank you so much for watching. I will be back soon with more electoral takes and also with more non-electoral takes soon. It's just, I'm like this from summer to fall in election years. I get really invested when there's a good primary too. If you're interested in more videos from me, you can check out my Patreon, linked in the description below. I upload a couple extra videos every month over there. I also have a Ko-fi if you're interested in a one-off way to support me financially. It makes a huge difference. Maybe consider subscribing if you want to make sure that you catch future videos like this from me. Thank you so much. I love you.